What if I told you that there was a philosophy so threatening to the established order that the most powerful institution in medieval Europe declared it heretical and banned it outright? It's a way of thinking so dangerous that those who dared to teach it were burned at the stake, their books destroyed, their very names erased from history. This is the story of Averroism, a philosophical movement that emerged in the 12th century and shook the foundations of Christian Europe. But to understand why this philosophy was so feared, we need to journey back to medieval Cordoba, to a brilliant mind that would change the course of Western thought forever. His name was Ibn Rushd, known to the Latin world as Averroes, born in 1126 in Muslim Spain. He was a polymath of extraordinary ability, a philosopher, physician, mathematician, and judge. But it was his revolutionary interpretation of Aristotle that would make him both famous and infamous across medieval Europe. You see, Aristotle's works had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. While Christian scholars struggled with basic philosophical questions, the Islamic world had preserved and expanded upon Greek philosophy. Averroes took this tradition and pushed it to its logical extreme, developing ideas that would terrify the church establishment. The first dangerous idea was his concept of the double truth. Averroes argued that there were two separate realms of truth: philosophical truth, discovered through reason and logic, and religious truth, revealed through scripture and faith. These truths, he claimed, could even contradict each other without either being false. Imagine the implications. If a philosopher could use reason to conclude that the world was eternal, while scripture taught that God created it at a specific moment in time, both could be true in their respective domains. This wasn't just intellectual flexibility. It was a direct challenge to the church's claim to absolute authority over all knowledge. But Averroes went further. He argued that the human intellect was not individual but universal, a single, shared intelligence that all humans participated in. This meant that individual human souls were not immortal. When you died, your individual consciousness simply ceased to exist, returning to the universal intellect like a drop of water returning to the ocean. Can you imagine how this sounded to Christian ears? The entire foundation of Christian theology rested on the immortality of the individual soul, on personal salvation and eternal judgment. Averroes was essentially saying that heaven and hell, as individual experiences, were impossible. His third revolutionary idea was even more radical. Averroes argued that the universe was eternal and uncreated. While he acknowledged God's existence, he saw God not as a creator who brought the world into being at a specific moment, but as the eternal source of the world's eternal existence. The universe had always existed and would always exist, with God as its perpetual sustainer rather than its temporal creator. This directly contradicted the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. If the universe was eternal, then there was no moment of creation, no fall from grace, no need for redemption. The entire Christian narrative of history, from Genesis to Revelation, became meaningless. When these ideas reached the University of Paris in the 13th century, they caused an intellectual earthquake. Young scholars, hungry for sophisticated philosophical tools, embraced Averroes' commentaries on Aristotle. They formed what came to be known as the Latin Averroists, a group of radical thinkers who applied Averroes' methods to Christian theology. The most famous of these was Siger of Brabant, a master at the University of Paris who taught that philosophy and theology were completely separate domains. He argued that a proposition could be true in philosophy, even if it contradicted Christian doctrine. Students flocked to his lectures, drawn by the intellectual freedom this approach offered. But the church was watching. In 1270, the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier, issued a condemnation of 13 propositions associated with Averroism. This was just the beginning. 7 years later, he expanded this to 219 condemned propositions, creating what historians call the Great Condemnation of 1277. The condemnation was brutal and comprehensive. It targeted not just Averroism, but any philosophy that seemed to limit God's absolute power through rational argument. The condemned propositions included the eternity of the world, the unity of the intellect, the impossibility of individual immortality, and the idea that there could be truths in philosophy that contradicted faith. Masters at the University of Paris were forced to swear oaths against teaching these doctrines. Books were burned. Scholars were exiled or imprisoned. Sigurd of Brabant fled Paris and was later murdered under mysterious circumstances. Some say by an assassin sent by the church. Others claim by a deranged secretary. Either way, the message was clear. This philosophy was too dangerous to be tolerated. But why was the church so afraid? What made Averroism more threatening than other heresies? The answer lies in the nature of the threat it posed. Traditional heresies challenged specific doctrines, the nature of Christ, the role of the clergy, the meaning of the sacraments. Averroism was different. It challenged the very possibility of Christian knowledge. It suggested that reason properly applied led to conclusions that contradicted faith. This wasn't just heresy, it was intellectual rebellion. Moreover, Averroism appealed to the educated elite. While most heresies attracted the poor and dispossessed, Averroism seduced university masters and their students. It offered a sophisticated, intellectually satisfying alternative to Christian philosophy. If left unchecked, it could have undermined the Church's authority among the very people who ran medieval society. The Church's response went beyond condemnation. They commissioned their greatest thinkers, including Thomas Aquinas, to refute Averroes point by point. Aquinas wrote an entire treatise on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists, specifically to combat these dangerous ideas. He argued that Averroes had misunderstood Aristotle, that reason properly applied actually supported Christian doctrine. But here's the fascinating part. In trying to refute Averroes, Christian philosophers had to engage seriously with his arguments. They couldn't simply dismiss him as ignorant or evil. He was too brilliant, his knowledge of Aristotle too deep, his logical reasoning too rigorous. So they had to develop more sophisticated philosophical tools to counter him. In many ways, Averroes forced Christianity to become more philosophical. The great scholastic synthesis of the 13th century, the marriage of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology, was largely a response to the Averroist challenge. Thinkers like Aquinas had to prove that reason and faith were compatible, that philosophy properly understood led to Christian conclusions. But did the Church's campaign succeed? In the short term, yes. Averroism, as an open philosophical position, was effectively eliminated from Christian universities. The Latin Averroists were silenced, their work suppressed, their influence minimized. Yet in the long term, the ideas persisted. They went underground, circulating in secret among intellectuals who found them too compelling to abandon. During the Renaissance, when the Church's authority began to weaken, Averroism experienced a revival. Thinkers like Pietro Pomponazzi openly defended the mortality of the soul, while others explored the implications of an eternal universe. More importantly, Averroism established a precedent. It showed that reason could lead to conclusions that contradicted religious authority. It demonstrated that philosophy could be an independent source of knowledge, not merely the handmaiden of theology. In doing so, it planted the seeds of the modern separation between reason and faith, between science and religion, between philosophy and theology. The ideas that the Church found so dangerous in the 13th century would eventually become commonplace. In the modern world, it's the notion that reason and faith operate in separate domains, that scientific truth and religious truth might conflict, that individual consciousness might not survive death. These are now mainstream positions in secular philosophy. So the next time you encounter the idea that science and religion address different questions, or that reason should be free from religious authority, remember Averroes. Remember the philosophy that was so dangerous it had to be banned, and the brave thinkers who risked everything to defend the power of human reason. The Church may have won the battle, but in the long war between authority and inquiry, between faith and reason, between dogma and doubt, the dangerous philosophy of Averroism planted seeds that would eventually bloom into the modern world. And Perhaps that's the most dangerous philosophy of all, the one that refuses to stay buried, no matter how hard the authorities try to suppress it. The story of Averroism reminds us that ideas, once unleashed, have a power of their own. They can be banned, their advocates silenced, their books burned, but they cannot be unthought. And in the end, that might be the most dangerous truth of all.